Ben Nicholson-Smith at the Letters, MLB insider and Janus analyst joins me now. What's up, brother? How we doing?
JD, I'm doing well. Good to be talking some Jays with you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with this. What are you most optimistic about from the weekend? Is it the offense or the bullpen?
It's got to be the bullpen. I mean, they were great, with the exception of Mitch White loading the bases
Yeah.
to round out yesterday's game. The bullpen was incredible, and you think about, okay, they don't have their ace starting pitcher, they don't have their closer, so
Mhm.
they're going to need to rely on their bullpen this weekend against a pretty good Diamondbacks team. They didn't look good, but still, on paper, a pretty good team. They've came in 10 games above 500 in first place. So in those circumstances, you just wouldn't be sure what to expect, but they really stepped up. Guys like Jimmy Garcia stepping up. Nate Pearson was great Friday and Saturday. Tim
Mhm.
Mesa just throws basically one pitch and then gets out of that jam. Swanson was really good all weekend. So I think that the Jays, as they move ahead here, have to feel really good about their bullpen. And of course, you're going to look for upgrades. Of course, maybe there is a way to improve on a guy like a Mitch White in that bullpen, but man, they are in a pretty good spot with their relievers.
Yeah. Going into yesterday, the bullpen ERA was fifth. Their K per nine, this is the most shocking of them all because we've talked ad nauseum about how these guys don't have enough swing and miss in the bullpen, and I know Nate Pearson changed that to a degree, and then with the way that Tim Mays has been pitching. But yeah, third in all of baseball, K per nine, and then walks per nine. They're first. They're not giving any free passes. It's a really, really good job that this bullpen has done lately, and it has been a bit of a quiet story. And so, yeah, it makes the most sense to kind of highlight them, especially no Ramon coming out of this thing. But yeah, I don't like you're right about the upgrade thing. Of course, there's always going to be shopping around. You can always potentially add a name, but given the resurgence of Richards, the way that he has just completely bounced back, the way I feel now about Nate Pearson, the way I feel now about Tim Mesa, the fact that they're going to have a signing coming back into the mix for this bullpen, like I think it's safe to say right now, from my vantage point, it's the lowest of all of the priorities heading into the deadline, which is kind of shocking to me given where this front office has been with building this thing the last couple of years.
Yeah, and you just think about the standard, okay, contending team, you're always looking for bullpen help, you're always looking for rotation help.
Hmm.
And the Blue Jays, of course, you still have to stay in on those areas. Even with Manoah now back in the rotation
Hmm.
and Ryu coming back, there's still the Gosman question and there's still the need for depth. So you're going to check and see if there's a way to acquire some sort of starting pitching help at the deadline. And the same with the bullpen, because even with Chad Green come back, and even with Jay Jackson now emerging, and this bullpen looks really good, you still need to be in there in case someone trips on a dugout staircase in 10 days'
Hmm.
time, and you need to know what the market is. So, at the same time, though, for this season, and even now we've been looking ahead to next year, next off season, I mean,
Hmm.
this is a team that's pretty well positioned from a pitching standpoint, where they have 5 starting pitchers, they have a bullpen that's in place. This deadline and even this season, it's really going to be about adding bats for the Blue Jays.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, we've seen like the Gossman stuff. I watched you and Arden talking about it over the weekend just on TV, and it seemed like, hey, they're just being overly cautious. Like, all right, now he's not pitching in the next series either. Like, all right, we're confident that this is just kind of nothing overly cautious situation because they have time they can use it.
Well, they'll end up giving him at least 2 weeks because
Hmm.
he last pitched on the Saturday before the All-Star break, and he obviously didn't pitch this past weekend. And by the time he pitches next, at the earliest, it'll be next weekend against Seattle. So that'll be a nice little 2-week break. I mean, that's pretty much an unofficial IL stint as it is. We'll see if he ends up needing a bit more time. Obviously, he's been able to throw on flat ground at Rogers Center, so that's a good sign. He hasn't been throwing a bullpen session yet, so still some strides to go there for Gosman. But they are leading us to believe that they expect him back at some point pretty soon.
Okay. And then what about Romano? Same thing?
Yeah, and he's saying that he's been able to,
Go.
progress. So he's, I think, in a good spot. I would expect that he pitches at some point against the Padres.
All right, then I'm going to get into basically all the rehab guys here, just since this is what we're doing. We
Yeah.
like the Ryu stuff has been very public, and so I don't know what kind of mystery is left there, but I am kind of curious what you think his role is going to be with this team. But you mentioned Chad Green, and he was always bound to be he's the actual deadline addition to the bullpen. This is someone who does bring swing and miss. This is someone who has pitched within the division, someone who I've always been a huge fan of. But he's been like the news around him. If we're talking about him versus the other three guys, or even Ryu, who's been gone all year, it's been far more quiet. What's your understanding of where Chad Green's at?
So he's in Florida physically, and
Mhm.
he's working his way back. He's throwing bullpens and live BPs. He hasn't been in games, so they haven't started his game clock, which to me says he's behind Ryu. I mean,
Mhm.
Ryu is actually progressing pretty quickly right here, even to the point that you kind of wonder if they needed to do something with Gosman. If Gosman needed another week and he had to go on the injured list, would you call up Ryu and start him against the Mariners? I mean,
Yes.
I don't think that, right? Like I would. I don't think it's the craziest thing to consider that. Just given how well he pitched at AAA on the weekend. So I think Ryu has to be your insurance behind Gosman there, which speaks to how quickly he's been able to come back from Tommy John. And Green had Tommy John basically the same time, but he seems to be on a slower timetable. Now, once he does get to the point that he's in games, it probably doesn't take all that long. Like once he's in an actual minor league game, he could be in a major league game within 2 weeks. But he hasn't been in that minor league game just yet. So that to me says he's probably more than a couple weeks away.
So I thought the story of this weekend for sure, along with you, was the bullpen. It was just to do that without Romano and have everybody come in and look great. Other than again Mitch White, which I'll say it again because boy, it's frustrating to
I know.
watch him pitch and realize that the Jays actually gave something up for him. But I thought the story of the weekend was the bullpen. It was nice to see the bats come alive and actually give them some room for error, even though a lot of it was late in ball games, you're like, who cares? It's not, when it happens. It's just, does it happen at all? It did. But now this week that we're going to pivot forward into, to me, is going to be all about the starting pitching because you have Manoah's next start against a more difficult opponent than throwing him out there against the Tigers and saying, hey, these guys stink. Go mow them down, which he did. He totally exceeded expectations. I don't want to take anything away from him. He looked great. He was in command. Awesome, awesome, awesome. But this is another step. He hasn't fully earned anybody's trust back yet, right? Like, we need to see what happens with Manoah. We need to see what happens with Gossman's injury because, it seems okay-ish. It doesn't sound like it's dire straits. He hasn't been put on the IL, but it still is going to feel a lot better once you actually see him out there back in the rotation. And then the other guy is going to be Ryu, where he pitches one more time down at AAA, and he keeps doing what he was doing, which was, I think, 5 punch-outs and 1 walk, right? Or no walks. Did he walk anyone?
I don't think he walked anyone,
Yeah, maybe he didn't
but I
walk
could be wrong.
anybody. Gave up a bomb, right? 1 solo shot. That was the big moment against Ryu. But otherwise, looked like Ryu. They're building the pitch count back up. But yeah, if he looks ready to go, I don't know. I don't know how you don't start mixing him back in and saying, yeah, let's see what he looks like at the major league level. So yeah, and then you add on top of that, the last component of this is out of all the rumors that are circulating around the Blue Jays right now, the names that are starting to pop are starting pitchers. We've seen the link to Marcus Stroman over the last 48 hours, where there's been a couple of different reports that the Jays are hot and heavy for him. And then I even saw their name linked to Jordan Montgomery, which I thought was kind of interesting. But yeah, I think that this week is going to be about starting pitching and the Blue Jays trying to piece together what they look like heading into the deadline.
Yeah, I think that's a good read. I think that's a good read for sure. And there's a lot of moving pieces there, right? When you start with Ryu and he did not walk anyone. He struck out 5
Mm-hmm.
in that outing on the weekend for Buffalo. So it's either his last AAA start or his first major league start this week. You would think. I mean, once he gets
Mm-hmm.
to 85 pitches at AAA, you're not going to keep him there. I mean, I think they would bring him back after that. So you got Ryu, Manoah, like you said. I mean, he needs to continue building his, beyond the results, his delivery looked better, his confidence, his demeanor on the mound, all of those things look better in Detroit. He, talking to him afterwards, he really seemed to be in a really good headspace. He seemed to be feeling really good about the outing. So all that's positive, but he needs to build on that against San Diego. And that's not an easy offense, even though this team is struggling. So, you add on to that Gosman's questions around his health. I think you're right to say that this rotation is really going to reveal a lot about itself this week. And the trade stuff, as I said, they have to be in on the market for starting pitchers. I would be
Mm-hmm.
really surprised if Marcus Stroman pitches for the Blue Jays this year. I just would be really really surprised for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
But of course, you see those rumors, and it's always interesting. But I would be very very surprised.
You want to go through those reasons beyond the prospect depth?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, yeah. So there's number one, right? Like
Uh-huh.
he's going to be very coveted, and the Cubs are going to have their choice of a lot of teams. So there's reason number one. Reason number two is I actually don't see starting pitching as the most pressing need. So even if the Blue Jays are going to survey things and be thorough, I don't see starting pitching as when they have potentially six starters. I don't know that you need to go out and get a seventh.
Mhm.
And then this is pretty significant too, but I just don't see Marcus Stroman being the guy that the Blue Jays pursue. Like they know each other obviously really well, and
Mhm.
I think that Stroman still has some fondness for Toronto. He
Mhm.
obviously still has some connections here. Ultimately, the front office is going to prioritize winning. They're not gonna be sitting there thinking, oh, do we? It's not about whether they like the guy or not. It's about whether he can help them win. And Marcus Stroman can help any major league team win games, but we're still talking about someone who, when he was traded out of Toronto, like that day, you heard shouting from the clubhouse, like
It was
something was
acrimonious.
going on. Yeah,
Like
it was
it was not a good
acrimonious.
departure.
I don't know who was shouting at whom, but I was standing outside the clubhouse that day, and I heard shouting when he was traded. And then Marcus Stroman was walking out of the clubhouse. Myself and a couple other writers were trying to talk to him. It was his last, moments in Toronto, and he just, walks right past. Does not talk to the media that day. And look, it's an emotional day.
Mhm.
These things happen. But yeah, I just personally I don't see it. So we'll see. I would be very very surprised.
Yeah, the only way that I could see it is if the Jays were moving one of their starters back to Chicago. And that doesn't make any sense because there's no guy that makes sense for Chicago that Toronto owns, right? Like that.
I'm sure they'd love Manoa, but I don't
Sure, but
think the Jays are gonna do
yeah,
that.
but that's what I mean. That's a non-starter. You're not trading Manoa for you're not trading big Manoa for little Manoa, Like that's just not happening. It's just not
Yeah.
for older Manoa. You're not going backwards with that one. So I don't really get it. But I will say this. How much of these next couple weeks do you think like the Ryu factor, the Gossman health. Let's say to a lesser extent too the Bassett health, and I know the broadcast talking about rubber arm and all this different stuff, but Arden was mentioning how he was a little banged up going to the All-Star break, and I don't know how much that's improved or something that can improve. Plus, what Manoa is going to do is actually going to shape how aggressive they get with that market.
So, yeah, I just the starting pitching market?
Yeah, like let's say the best case scenario happens where Manoa starts to look like himself over the next couple of weeks, and we're like, oh crap, Manoa looks like he's back. Is there something that he can do essentially in 2 weeks to convince the Blue Jays that they don't need to go out and address this in a meaningful way? Same thing with because
Oh, yeah.
obviously if Gossman is hurt, then that changes the parameters. If Bassett is hurt, that
Yeah.
changes things in terms of how aggressive they have to get. Hard to imagine that there's anything Ryu can do in 2 weeks. But it feels like Manoa has to be the biggest part of all of this that I'm talking about when it comes to like shaping their deadline plans with starting pitching.
Yeah, because, ultimately it seems like they have the numbers right now, so you wanna have some confidence that you have the top of the rotation guys, and I think, when healthy, he's an ace. Barrios looks like a really solid number 2 starter, and, beyond that, you need 1 or 2 others, to make your way through the 4 rounds of the playoffs that you're gonna have to win if you're a wild card team.
Hmm.
Which I do agree, by the way, that the AL East needs to still be the target for the Blue Jays. 6 games out, I mean, that certainly, is a lot more appealing than playing a wild card series, so we'll see where that goes. But as for Manoa, I really think that if he can show them in 2 starts that he's able to stay within the strike zone, attack hitters in the zone, repeat his delivery, and just stay in that fluid, athletic attack mode,
Hmm.
then you're talking about someone who will be an effective, let's not say an ace, but let's say a number 3, number 4 starter. Like, that's a better than a back of the rotation guy, and I think that's within his realm of possibilities for the next 2 weeks, and that would certainly help the Blue Jays as they move ahead here.
Yeah. I can't imagine them taking what few assets they have. And that remains the thing from everyone that I've talked to is no, there's no surprise guys in the farm system right now that other teams are just coveting en masse. They've got the same names that we've all heard. And yeah, so the idea of them being in on the Stroman type still doesn't feel overly realistic. But are you starting to get a sense of maybe some of the other Jays targets that they are looking at?
I think it's pretty broad at this point. I think it's
Mhm.
really broad. I remember last year this time, they were looking at relievers, and the list of names that they had was about 70 names,
Hmm.
70. So I mean,
Yeah.
I would expect a similarly broad approach this year. I think that that's where you get reports that, they've checked on a Marcus Stroman because, this is a front office that is certainly very thorough. I think they'll be equally thorough when it comes to the relief pitchers this year, even with that being less of a need. And I think they also need to be checking on bats. I mean, it's pretty clear that this team, when they're DHing Alejandro Kirk,
Hmm.
when Brandon Belt is your primary DH, when you look at the bench, on days that a Kevin Kiermaier has a stiff back, for example, you just start running out of bats that you really want to use. And I think that it's clear that a switch hitter or a right-handed hitter would be the best option for this team. But Alejandro Kirk going into the season, I think, was a logical candidate to DH when he was a Silver Slugger winner and
Hmm.
had come off such a great season. But you look back at what he's done in the last calendar year.
Hmm.
He's a 239 hitter. He's got a 316 slugging percentage. He's got 7 home runs in the last calendar year. That's not a guy I want DHing. And Alejandro Kirk's still an important part of this team. But if I'm the Blue Jays, I'm trying to find other guys who can DH along with Brandon Belt because even if Belt continues being as great as he has for the last few months, are you sure that he's going to be healthy? Are you sure that you can't upgrade over an Ernie Clement or a Nathan Lucas on your bench? Like they have to find a position player. They have to find a bat this deadline.
Yeah, I think that they've got to find two. The interesting one with Kirk to me is okay, for sure they need the DH right-handed bat, right? That's just very clear. If you say what's the number one need of the Blue Jays, that's it right now. Like to me, there's no question. But Kirk, over the last month, and I know we have the full calendar year of bad Kirk, but his OPS in the last 28 days is 256, Ben. Like
Yeah.
he's unplayable at this point. And I'm starting to wonder if we're not just entering the territory of, hey, Kirk's going to lose DH at bats, so they're looking for a DH. Do you think that they could be in the mix for a catcher? Like, ironically, after an offseason that was all about, hey, the Jays have too many catchers, the Jays are going to shop a catcher and they trade Moreno. Like, is that one of the ways that they can improve this team, is looking at that market?
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I mean, I think it depends on who the catcher is because I do think that going into next year, you gotta, you work with Kirk in the offseason. You're still optimistic that at age 25, whatever he'll be, he can bounce back from this season. You know it's in there. You know he has the bat to ball skills. But if you can get someone this season to help you out for the course of the next couple of months, then that could help you. That could make a difference. And Sal Perez obviously is the big name. I don't see. I think he has 3 years of control remaining. I don't see him being a fit. So maybe it's a much smaller addition, smaller scale addition. But I don't think you rule that out at this point because you have to be open minded. Having depth at catcher is always a good thing.
Hmm.
It's you're one injury away from playing Tyler Heineman and Alejandro Kirk, right? If Danny Jansen were to take a foul ball off a forearm in the wrong spot, right?
Danny,
So,
not
I
exactly
think
Cal
that
Ripken Jr. either.
right. So, I think you gotta explore those options. To me, I'm probably starting in the outfield. The catcher wouldn't be the first
Mhm.
place I would look, but yeah, you could be open to it.
Yeah, I just feel like you have to be at this point. Like, I, Kirk gets up, and you know there's not going to be any extra base power. And then even if he does poke one of his singles, which is getting rarer and rarer, what he's the worst base runner in the entire sport. Like he's got to be there
Yeah.
with like what Miguel Cabrera. Like
Yeah.
who? How many guys are on the list that are below him? So he gets up and he's like clogging up the base paths, and you're like, what is the point here? And everyone's made like the discussion about how his defense has improved. I'm like, all right, great. But he's not a gold glover behind the plate. He's still not your primary option like Danny Jansen is. Danny Jansen is your best defensive catcher still. And so at some point here over the next couple of weeks, like if we're talking about stuff like, hey, what can Alek Manoah show to make sure that the Jays don't need to be a little bit more drastic when it comes to what their starting pitching depth is going to look like? I just have to feel like catcher is growing in terms of import. You're right. I'm with you. I'd love to see the outfield bat. I just want to see the DH. Shulman was on here last week, and I agree with his position, which is they need a right-handed Brandon Belt, like an older guy, desperate to win, who grinds out at bats, makes pitchers work for it, and can draw a walk. Like that would just be
Yeah.
perfect. But if you told me
Well,
right now today, hey, what's the number two thing that this team needs? I would say it's catching depth.
yeah, it wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt. I think as it stands now, with the roster that you do have, Danny Jansen needs to be catching like 4 or 5 days a week.
Exactly, and that's a
And
big workload for him, man.
it is. It is. And, we're still 2.5 months of regular season baseball away from the playoffs, and then you have a full month of playoffs if you're going to accomplish what you want to accomplish. So that's a lot of baseball left, and that's a lot of wear and tear. So you really do need to be sharing that, and that's obviously why I'm not saying 7 days a week for Danny Jansen, but he's just hitting
Mhm.
so much better than Kirk right now. And Jansen, same sort of look for him, right? Last calendar year, he's got 19 homers and a 788 OPS. So
Mhm.
this is a guy who's really consistently been a very good hitter for the Blue Jays, including in some big moments like
Oh yeah.
yesterday with that 3-run double. So you feel great about Danny Jansen. I think if Kirk is catching Manoa, let's say, so he's in there once every 5 days, maybe he's DHing or pinch hitting beyond that once in a while, because he's still a good pinch hit option if you need a single. I think you're okay with that. I don't think you need to desperately go out there and try to add a second catcher if Kirk's catching a couple days a week. That's totally fine. But I think that you definitely need to be out there looking for bats. A right-handed Brandon Belt would be great, kind of like a Steve Pierce, who they traded away 5 years
Mm.
ago to the Red Sox,
Yeah.
and obviously went on to be the World Series MVP. But they need to find this year's version of a Steve Pierce.
Yeah. God. They got Espinal back in that trade, right? That's
Yep.
how that worked out, right? And it wasn't too
Just
overly.
flip it this year.
Yeah.
Trade Espinal away,
Yeah.
and then you get a new Steve
Get a new
Pierce.
Steve Pierce. God, that Steve Pierce run, I will never forget watching him at first base do the splits over and over and over again and just pick balls going, wait, what? And then him get just extremely hot and carry Boston to that World Series. I do still believe, though, that the writers were like me going, we don't want to fully admit we were so wrong on David Price, and they did give it to Pierce. It should have been David Price. He should have been World Series MVP. But either way, man, that was one hell of a run. Do you know who is that Steve Pierce to you right now? Because I had Morosi last week. We were talking about it, and he strangely mentioned Bellinger. And I went, I can't see another lefty bat right now for them. And I just don't know where he plays or who he replaces. But he did make the point of this front office is a group where if they target someone, they return to the scene of the crime, right? Who was the pitcher that was
Yep.
just in town not too long ago? Is it Heaney? Andrew Heaney? Yeah,
Yes.
where they were like, yeah, I turned the Blue Jays down again. My wife went, don't you feel bad turning these guys down year over year?
Yep.
But that is a little bit their MO. And I don't know if that's the exact same with every front office. I'm sure if you like someone, you don't stop liking them immediately. But yeah, have you seen any of those names out there where you go, oh, you know what? The Jays liked this guy. And so don't be surprised if they circle back around when it comes to the deadline.
Well, I do think it's a good point by Morosi that they do tend to circle back, right? And Kevin Gausman would be proof of that when you think about how many times they tried to acquire him before they actually did. I don't see Bellinger personally, just because I think they are much more likely to target a right-handed hitter. But you look around, there's not a ton of great right-handed hitters out there. I do think like where I gravitate is the Mets, and they're 7 games under 500 right now. We'll see what the next couple weeks bring for them. You probably can't make that
Mm.
trade today, but I look at Tommy Pham, and he's 35 years old. He's got a 271 batting average and 823 OPS. He's stolen 10 bases. He's got 9
Mhm.
homers. That's who you want to me. Like, I would not be surprised if Tommy Pham in the course of August and September goes and hits 10 home runs, or leads his team in home runs. He might, the way the Blue Jays are going with not very much power from Springer and Vladdy and Kirk and Varsho and a lot of these guys that we thought might have a bit more power this year, Tommy Pham might hit more home runs than anyone on the Blue Jays in the
Yeah.
course of the next 2 months. It's possible. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's possible. And so I think that would be a name that I would point to.
Yeah, I like that name. That's Ennis's name too. He's starting to get a little bit of popularity here, and I think one of the reasons you like Tommy Pham is the same reason that I like Danny Jansen, which is I just believe in clutch. And I'm doing this with you before we pivot to something a little bit more. I don't even want to say serious, but what is your You're a real baseball guy, You're not me who's just watching on the couch having fun, having a beer at the Rogers Center, going down there. But I really do believe that Danny Jansen is him, as the kids say, where he steps up in a big spot. And despite him not being one of the team's best 5 hitters, I go, this is great that you're here right now. We wanted you here right now. And I know that maybe some of this is a bit of recency bias, considering that he's had 2 massive hits, like in the last, 2 series? 3, yeah, 2 series or
Yep.
3 series. But yeah,
Two.
what do you make of it when you say like someone is a clutch hitter, and like how much do you put faith in something like that?
Well, I kind of think Danny Jansen is one of the Jays' best five hitters right now, which is maybe a good thing or bad thing depending on how you want to spin it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that made me feel both ways. Where I went, you said it, and I
yeah,
went, you know what? Yeah, he might be. And then I went, yeah, the best. That's what you wanted.
yeah. As for the question of clutch, I I think it's John Schneider's definition of clutch to say that it's doing the same thing you normally do, just with higher stakes. And I
Yeah,
kind of like that definition because I don't think that, Derek Jeter, for example, or David Ortiz, pick your clutch player in
sure.
baseball. I don't think they necessarily did anything different mechanically or with their preparation. And the results were like Derek Jeter hit singles in spring training and he hit singles in May and he hit singles in the playoffs. And, it adds up to an amazing, amazing career. And David Ortiz hit home runs in spring training, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that Danny Jansen is basically doing the same things that he normally would do. I think the clutch is real. I think a
Mhm.
lack of clutch is real. I think the pressure is real. I mean, it is real. I mean, players talk about
Of
getting
course.
nervous. Players talk about the mental side of it. There's definitely a skill to handling that pressure, and sometimes it's experience. Sometimes it's you've been there before. And Derek Jeter played in October every single year, so it became kind of normal for him. And I have no doubt that that helped him. So I think that there is a difference. Like some players are not good at handling the stress of trying to perform in a huge spot, and some players are good at it. But I think the guys who are good at it basically access their May 15th mode,
Hmm.
and they are just consistent in accessing that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The only part of it that I think is underrated, and I don't know how much of this Danny Jansen has right now, to be quite honest, but is that when you're someone who doesn't let the moment get to you and you're competing against someone, that can get to them. So you start to build that reputation
Yeah.
up. And I think that part of being clutch and that leveling effect is that it might rock the person that's pitching to you,
Yeah.
or the hitter where they go, ah, man, I know this person's not going to make a mistake, or I know this person's not going to give me the easy out, that I'm going to have to battle through this. And that mental wear and tear, I think that adds into the clutch, that the person's ethos, that their reputation, it actually has an impact on these games. It has to. Like it has to. If you've ever like done anything, played golf next to somebody who you think is kind of clutch and you're
Yeah.
close and you're tight with it, you're thinking about stuff like that. You're like, that this person's not going to mistake. Who's likely to make it? Me. And that affects you. And I know that that's like, hey, you're not a pro athlete mentality, but I think that extends to everybody. I really do. I think that's all walks of life kind of situation. You're just around people where they know they have that confidence and you start to doubt your own self. And I think that maybe Danny Jansen starts to develop a little bit of that, just as a tough out, as a guy who's going to make you work for it. Okay,
Yeah.
this one's a little. I'm ending on this one because I couldn't start with this, but it is a story out of the weekend for me, and I pitched it even on Friday. I led my show with it. So the Jays sweep, awesome. They beat Arizona. They whoop them up. They get the 3 wins. That's by far the most important thing. It's an overall positive weekend. But this is the team that you made your splashy trade with in the offseason. And Varsho comes in and he actually gets an RBI to end that game, but he doesn't start because it's a lefty pitcher and they decide, all right, we're going to give you a day off. And it's like the guy that you got for set free in free agency, Kevin Kiermaier, is also an awesome outfielder defensively. Like, I know that he's not leading him in defensive runs saved or whatever. Like, that has been Varsho, and Varsho's been healthier, whatever, blah, 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 blah. But Kiermaier has been a stud against left-handed pitching. And Varsho just cannot find it unless it's essentially that drag bunt or he's using his speed to get on. And yeah, Gurriel, like Moreno hits the bomb. Gurriel has two hilariously spectacular plays in the outfield. We always knew he had the arm, but the one diving play was especially beautiful. And, he's piecing hits together. And I couldn't help but leave the weekend thinking about the optics of the Varsho trade today. And yeah, how we're feeling about it, especially as Varsho has started, July, not exactly red hot after a much better June. Yeah, what do you think the Jays are expecting at this point? Because there's been a lot of discussion about the pressure that he puts on himself, but this isn't the guy at the plate that the Jays were expecting. We thought there was going to be more power. We thought that there was going to be more on base. How does this turn around for him?
Yeah, it's been a tough stretch, right? Like you think about 4 for 33 in July, like he's basically done nothing at the plate for this last couple weeks here. And he's been underwhelming at the plate all season long relative to what he did last year, relative to what kind of potential he had. So Where it goes from here, I think he still probably projects as a average or slightly to above average hitter, with some power, who can play really, really good defense and make good decisions on the bases, and be a really fast base runner for you, who overall just impacts the game in a lot of different ways and is a really good ball player. And I think that that should be the expectation for
Hmm.
Varsho. I certainly expect that of him. I think that he can be an impact player for the Blue Jays for the next few years. It
Hmm.
just hasn't looked like that right now. So I look at the trade as a whole, and I think the Diamondbacks did well. This is obviously a trade that Diamondbacks should be happy with, to have Moreno there, to have Lourdes Gurriel Jr. having an all-star season before he hits free agency. All those
Hmm.
things are good for Arizona, but I don't think that makes it a loss for the Blue Jays. I don't think that they're necessarily a better team with Lourdes Gurriel Jr. and Gabriel Moreno still in this organization right now. I think that Varsho's defense has made a big difference. And like, if put it this way, and like, I'm kind of considering this for the first time as I ask it right now, but if you could go back and just snap your fingers and undo that trade for the
100%
last
I
part of
would.
2020, you would do
Nope.
it?
Oh yeah, like I wouldn't even. Yeah, like you couldn't even
Really?
finish the question. Of course, I would undo it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's
why?
a
So
nightmare
why
of a
would
trade.
be?
Here's why, and this has been my point all along. Is those assets at the time, and I've heard from some people that Moreno was not as coveted as his Baseball America ranking, right? That some teams had some doubts about the power and blah 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 blah. That he might have been the Blue Jays' number one prospect and guy that everyone fell in love with here, but ultimately his value was not extraordinarily high. But to me, it's like you don't judge a trade based on even necessarily like first of all, I don't want to hear about like years of control. Like that's nice, but we already did this with this front office a couple of years ago, and I do think that it's something that does tend to get overvalued, especially considering where the Jays are at in their competitive window, which is, hey, we want to win a World Series right now. Like we've got 2 years with Vladdy and Bo here left. It's World Series winning time this moment. And to me, I just look at it and go, if the projection all along was to get an outfielder who can play defense and run the bases well, then you got that in Kevin Kiermaier. Like that's gettable through free agency. That's not something that you need to trade your top prospect and another good outfielder for who's having an all-star season. And so like, yeah, defensive run saved, awesome. Base runner, awesome. I love watching Daulton Varsho run. Like truly, I mentioned this last week. He's a football player playing baseball. It's so
Yeah.
fun watching him crash in the wall. I really like the guy. I want the guy to perform well. But for you to trade those two assets, especially given that there was a couple of years of indecision about whether or not to trade Lourdes Gurriel when he had control and going, yeah, well, we're trying to win now and he's a bat. So you kind of trade him at his lowest value and just throw him in as a chip. To me, it's like asset management. You get an F. It's an F of a trade. Lourdes might walk. It might only be 1 year of control. Yes, you're right that the Blue Jays might not be appreciably better, although I would argue that given the way that Alejandro Kirk is playing, I would love to see Moreno be able to steal at bats from him right now, or you go, hey, you know what, throw him in there. You have the righty bat. It's like, what's the easier thing to get at the deadline right now? Is it a bat that can hit home runs for you and drive in big runs? Or is it a guy who plays defense and, has an OPS of, what is it now, 640? Like, I just, to me, it's a no-brainer. I'd go back and redo the trade just because I'd want to have the assets to do something different with it.
Yeah, really interesting. And, that's a reasonable take. I think that, if someone looks at that trade and says they would want to go and undo it, that's fair. To me, I actually think, like, you're trying to win a World Series right here. I
Hmm.
think Varsho can help you win a World Series. I think he can be starting for you in October against really good right-handed pitching, and he can
Hmm.
play 9 innings, and he can play great defense, and he can run the bases and do some of those things better than a Lourdes Gurriel Jr. And I'm
Hmm.
not trying to be like an apologist for the front office here when I say
No one
this,
thinks that.
because they've made bad trades, right? You want to
Hmm.
talk about Mitch White for Nick Frasso?
Yeah.
That's a bad trade. I
Yeah.
I just don't think that Varsho's a really good player, and I just won't be surprised at all if Lourdes goes in one of his cold streaks and he is a 650 OPS,
He already
and Varsho
has
goes
last
out and
month.
right, right, and he looked really good this weekend, but
Mhm.
that can come and go. And I'm not projecting Varsho. Like, I'm not gonna sit here and say, oh, what if he goes out and hits 15 homers the rest of the way? What if he
Mhm.
just goes out and he's a league average hitter, which he's been his whole career? He's been a league average to above average hitter. If he just does that, just replicates where he's been for his career, combined with his defense and his base running, he
Mhm.
instantly becomes a very good player.
Yeah, I think he is a very good player, and I think that two things can be true here, where you might want to have him versus those two guys down the stretch in terms of who can be more valuable to you. I still think having the two guys, especially since like what we just outlined was, hey, what do the Jays need? They need a right-handed bat who can drive in runs and catching depth. It's hard for me to see the value of those two guys as more than what Varsho is going to bring you, especially given like the skill set that you need to go out and get Varsho. But yeah, to me, the main thing that will always that I won't let go of is I don't think that the Jays traded for Varsho thinking that he was just going to be an average bat. I think that they thought
Agreed.
that there was going to be more to uncover there, and especially with the power. And that, when we were having discussions in the offseason, and I don't mean you and I mean like the baseball community at large or the Blue Jays community at large, it was, boy, these guys are moving the fences in, and there's this power alley at the Rogers Center, and Daulton Varsho is going to rip so many home runs over that wall. And it's like, you know what I see a lot of? High heat going to Daulton Varsho and him just whiffing on it in horrific fashion. And if I'm looking at like some of the guys who have some of the worst at bats on the team for a team that like has struggled to drive in runs, where I go, okay, who are the criminal offenders of just like bad at bat, didn't even put some contact on it, didn't advance the runners? Like, where is he for you? Because he's pretty high for me.
Well, and you're right that there is seemingly a hole in his swing where
Yeah.
he can be pitched in that way where it's high heat, oftentimes up and in,
Yep.
and it's not looking good. To
No, yeah.
me, yeah, it hasn't
Yeah.
been good. I almost like as we're talking about this, though, like that for some reason, watching hitters strike out doesn't frustrate me. Like it really doesn't bother me. What bothers me is watching pitchers walk guys, which, as you said, Mitch White, like you're up 5 runs, you
Mhm.
can't walk the bases loaded. You can't
No,
do that.
awful.
It's just you can't do that. That frustrates me. And then what also frustrates me is I know this wasn't your question, but I guess I'm
Yeah,
just
no, let's do
taking
it.
this
Let's
on a
do it. This is
tangent
what we
here.
do here. This is what we do here. Let's just keep going. Keep
But
going.
so it's also when they make unnecessary outs on the bases,
Oh, yeah.
why?
Third in
Like
baseball.
this team, like I know they went into the season, they think we want to be aggressive on the bases. We want to push it. Okay,
Mhm.
great. So you realize maybe this is May 15th. You realize, oh, we're actually pushing it too far. And so we actually should slow down. We let Kiermaier do his thing. We let maybe Merrifield once in a while do his thing. But basically, we're actually going to be a bit more cautious on the bases. That should have happened on May 15th. Why
No
are we
kidding.
sitting here on July 17th talking about, oh, George Springer got thrown out twice, caught stealing this weekend, and Santiago Espinal is out there getting thrown out on the bases unnecessarily when we just saw earlier that same game
Mhm.
Lourdes Gurriel Jr. show off his arm.
Yep.
I just think this team as a whole needs to get it together on the bases and stop giving away outs because they are an older team. They are not as fast as they think they are, and they
Mhm.
need to start reining it in a little bit.
Yes. 1,000,000,000%. I've tried to do the why does the Blue Jays season feel more frustrating than it normally should for a market that isn't like the Blue Jays are not the Dodgers, right? Um, but they have been feeling like I would say the most disappointing teams in baseball this year. Mets with a bullet by a million miles. Mariners have been super disappointing. But I think if you polled like fan base happiness, and right now excluded because now they're red hot, so people would be kind of chill about it. But there's that feeling on the surface, like all of this is very tenuous with the way people feel about the baseball team. I said number one is definitely the division thing, is being in a wild card, especially an away team wild card. After what happened last year, I don't think that Blue Jays fans are feeling so great about it. But yeah, the other thing is, what was the identity of the team supposed to be? It was like this mature, gutty team. And to have be third in Major League Baseball in outs on the bases like that is just so unbelievably unacceptable for the mandate of this offseason. So you're right. Like for you, as someone who was told this and who watches the game closely and, doesn't get wrapped up in the day to day like me, was looking at the like larger picture. Of course, that's the one of the most frustrating things. Like, of course, that's so frustrating. And yes, the Espinal one against Gurriel, where it's like, that's your teammate for years. That's how he got Gold Glove consideration, is because he's got a cannon for an arm and you tested it there. It's like, it feels like absent-mindedness at times. And that, yes, I think as an observer, a fan, whatever, when you feel like someone isn't putting attention into detail and not caring, which is what that is, like, yeah, that's the number one criminal offense. No doubt about it. You're right.
Yeah, it can be really frustrating to watch. Now, as long as we're talking about base running, I will shout Vladdy out because I think his slow slide into
God,
second
that was
base
sexy.
was an It was an all-timer,
Yeah, it
right?
was
Like,
awesome.
that was
Yeah.
if they had a Hall of Fame for slides into second base, like, that would have been in
Yeah.
first ballot. It was
Gorgeous.
so good.
I
It
know.
was it's like one of those baseball categories that you think, like, it's not even like, oh, best pitching performances, like, best home runs, best like, you don't even think about it. It's not something you don't go to the game thinking you wanna see a nice slide into second base, but man, Vladdy just, like, created a new category right there.
Yeah. By the way, Jobo puts these videos up on YouTube. You better put the slide there on YouTube. All right, Joe?
1000%.
All right. Good job. All right, Benny. Thanks for making time today, buddy. I always appreciate it. Thanks for the perspective. And again, go listen to Ben's podcast at The Letters. It's excellent. Subscribe, review, watch him on TV. You see him everywhere. Right now on sportsnet.ca. Ben Nicholson-Smith. Talk to you soon, buddy.
Thanks, JD. Have a good one.